I would like now to talk a little bit about introductions, specifically introductions for the impromptu speech. And sort of the obvious question is, do you even need an introduction for such a short speech? And the answer is, well, maybe, maybe not. But really what I want to work on here is helping you develop a type of muscle memory, a type of an automatic response to always give orientations to those audiences as a way of being clear for that audience. So if your default is to preview and provide a roadmap for your audience, that's a good habit to have. Or at least it's good to have the option to choose not to have that clarity. But I'd rather the default to be clarity. But as we think about introductions and conclusions, I don't think necessarily about what the content is of the introduction or the conclusion. I typically think more in terms of function. So what does an introduction need to accomplish? Well, it should let the audience know that you've started. I mean, that's pretty important. But it also should provide a type of orientation, letting the audience know what you're going to be talking about during the time that you have with them. So you could think of the introduction of your speech as sort of the curtain coming up on that presentation, on that performance. So you want to make sure that you've got a good opening, that that curtain is coming up seamlessly, nicely. So one thing to imagine is don't immediately begin. Take some time before you start the speech. Allow for a pregnant pause maybe to draw attention. You do kind of want to be able to have an opening as opposed to some sort of seamless transition from the last person who was talking. I used to coach with someone, and he had been a Presbyterian minister. And when he really did good talks, he would, at the beginning, he would start off, and then he would begin. But that warm-up, that was doing something. It was drawing attention. But he had this routine, one that, by the way, I've totally stolen. I'm happy to plagiarize gestures. He would do this, and now I don't quite get into it as much as he does, but at the beginning of a class or a speech, I usually will kind of have some type of pregnant pause there at the beginning to draw attention. But once we've sort of started those words, I want the audience to know where we're going. So I want to have a clear opening, but then I want to move from that opening to orientation, helping the audience know how we're going to be spending our time. So for the impromptus, I think in this orientation, two things are particularly important. First off, state the thesis. That is ostensibly the most important line in your speech, so it deserves some attention. In terms of how you're performing it, you probably put a brief pause before that thesis sentence and after that thesis sentence, really trying to set it apart from the rest of what you're saying. After you've stated that thesis statement, I think the other sort of key thing that's happening in that orientation is you're previewing your main points. We'll return to this throughout the other speeches, but giving the audience a roadmap is beneficial, quite beneficial. And that's because, especially in these speeches, we're focusing on clarity, letting the audience know how many points I'm going to be discussing, what the nature of those points are. It helps clarify what we're going to be doing in that speech. So I've worked up a sample impromptu here, and I just want to deliver the introduction from it and kind of give you a sense for what this would sound like. So my speech is arguing the thesis that MOOCs can teach performance skills, and you see here my two main points are MOOCs allow for the efficient instruction of performance skills, and MOOCs allow for the productive student practice. So in this, you should be able to hear sort of an opening and an orientation where I'm stating the thesis and previewing the main points. All right? I'm now pretty invested in the conversation around MOOCs. I've taken MOOCs, I've taught MOOCs, and I have to admit, initially I was a bit skeptical whether or not a performance skill like public speaking could be taught in a MOOC environment. Obviously, now I'm a pretty strong believer in this, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. But I understand why people would be skeptical that the MOOCs cannot teach performance skills. That said, I would argue the exact opposite. MOOCs can teach performance skills. And I think there's a lot of ways that we could talk through this. There are two things that I really want to focus on. First, I think MOOCs allow for efficient instruction of performance skills. And that's pretty important. But beyond that, MOOCs are allowing for productive student practice. And so from there, I would transition into my first main point. But that's it. That was the whole introduction. You kind of knew that I had started, and you knew what I was arguing and how I would argue it. When we get into other speeches where introductions are maybe more elaborate affairs, we'll tend to that. But for the impromptu, I really want to strip down that introduction to its key functions, opening and orientation. So now what I'd like you to do is go ahead and you try. Take that prep speech, if you have one, and just wherever you are right now, perform a very short introduction for your impromptu speech. Now in the next lecture, we'll take up transitions and conclusions. But go ahead and practice that introduction now.